One of the main things I would like my work to do is to reveal itself slowly, continuously, and for you never to feel like you're really finished with looking at something. I feel like all my early experiences with art were quite formative and influenced the kind of art I enjoy looking at till this day. They were all things that were quite scary or quite dark or seemed very much for adults. The main art books I remember seeing when I was little were Francis Bacon, because my mother worked with David Sylvester on editing the interviews, so we had those in the house. But I always feel like these art books were on the top shelf. They were kind of not for children, but that we'd sneak looks at this art that seemed very scary and very grown up and dangerous almost. The other thing we had in our house was a book. We had this little catalogue of German art, and there was a George Grosz painting, just a gouache, and it was of a butcher's shop. But it was a butcher's shop that instead of animal meat, it was human meat. And I loved this image, and I'd feel like I'd kind of sneak looks at it, like you might look at Playboy or something, and just sort of thought it was so outrageous and sort of very serious, but funny, and sort of not for me. So I think art was something that seemed very glamorous and dangerous to me as a child. I've always thought of myself as a figurative painter. I mean, the figure was what I was most interested in as a young student and what kind of got me interested in art and looking at paintings. I started off very much looking only at figurative art, but there's always been a strong element of abstraction. But it's something that happens very naturally. If I paint a figure too completely, it disturbs me too much. I have to sort of break it down. I'm far more interested in a moment where figuration breaks down. I usually describe it as breaking down rather than becoming more abstract, because it really is this back and forth. And some works, and there'll often be works side by side in the studio, some that have far clearer graphic imagery and others that really don't. And it's always been important to me to have both. And some works walk the tightrope and have both within a painting. If I don't have a sort of figural idea, as it were, I get completely lost. And when I get lost, it goes too much into abstraction, and then I think sort of decoration. But the abstract artists I've loved the most, I mean, people like Gorky and de Kooning, I don't really think of as abstract either. And there's more abstract art is the stuff that interests me the least. I mean, I guess Gorky, yes, it's abstract, but it's got that same thing where it always feels like a thing happening in a place rather than a Rothko. I mean, early Rothko has that too, that kind of biomorphic moment that I love. But later, like Rothko and Newman, you know, that pure abstraction. I'm always more interested in that moment before that. Miro, Gorky, and de Kooning obviously went back and forth his whole life. I remember once hearing about a de Kooning, someone who owned a de Kooning, and they'd loved this painting for years, and then suddenly someone saw it in their house and said, "Oh, I love that cute little dog peering over the wall." And the person was never able to look at the de Kooning the same way ever again, because someone had sort of seen it this way, and then from then on they couldn't escape it. I think I'm constantly trying to balance, you know, make sure, you know, I don't mind the little dog peering over the wall, but I want it to shift and change into something else. But the little dog peering over the wall is there. I mean, often when I'm often hesitant, because someone might say that they see certain things in a painting, and I could walk you through a painting and point out what things, you know, what different parts of the painting are, or at least were while I was painting them. But I usually avoid doing that just because I really like the viewer to, you know, just what I've described, you know, have this state of flux. It's really important to me that nothing's too determined and pinned down, and that really you do get the sense of things that are still in the process of becoming. When I was a student in London, I'd go to the National Gallery a lot. One of my favorites was Degas. I think the paintings that meant the most to me and still do are the Young Spartans and the combing the hair image, which I think the colour of that maybe influenced me more than any other painting. And it was sort of seen through the eyes of Bacon. I think I first looked at Degas having looked at Bacon, And I knew that Bacon spoke very brilliantly about him. And I think that maybe got me interested the first time. Because, when you're young and you go to a big museum, there's so much. You don't, it's hard to really know what to look at. And I always love seeing what speaks to me. But thinking about it, I think the fact that Bacon pointed out Degas as someone who was completely, who had this very moving way of painting the human figure, that he stood out from the rest. The tension of the combing the hair, for example, the underlying sadism almost. I always find there's a kind of menace and a darkness in Degas' work that even if it's not really obvious, there's this angst or darkness basically just under the surface, which I think is there in nearly all the artists I respond to the most. But in this seemingly innocent subject of a young woman having her hair combed, there's this, I guess from the incredibly bright vermilions, this very intense oranges and reds. And then there's sort of quick strokes of black that emphasize the movement. And there's just this incredible tension there that I respond to a lot, and a simplicity as well with the composition. And the Spartans, it's just such an incredible image of, the boys on one side and the girls on the other. And it's an image I'm working from a lot, actually, recently. So I'd looked at Degas a lot when I was young. And then a couple of years ago, I was back in London and at the National Gallery. And after not having looked closely for years, I sort of fell in love all over again with the Young Spartans. And I often think, you kind of reach out for the thing that's going to be helpful to you at any moment, any particular moment in your work. That's why sometimes a much loved painting can be something you don't think about for years. And then there's a moment when you really need it, and you seize it as something that's going to be helpful. And I'd been painting these crowds of women, and I very much wanted to start also doing boys and men. And I was very stuck with how to start. And the Spartans kind of really gave me this clue of how to move forward. And it was the incredible, there's young boys who are just on the cusp of manhood, and they've got this, first of all, the composition and just the crisscrossing of the legs. And, there are too many legs for the figures, in fact, if you count them. But that kind of coming of age thing. But those boys are so moving to me. They have this expression of both arrogance and sort of nervousness. They're timid, but they're trying to be braver than they actually are. And something about that seems very poignant, I think, particularly today. I feel like it's a difficult time for boys. There's so many mixed messages, that sort of thing of being sensitive. It just seems to sum up how complicated it is to be a teenage boy, this adolescent thing of, and then you can see their desire, but they're also scared. So it's just got so many layers of meaning and different emotions embodied in these figures. And then, of course, the amazing girl with her thrusting arm, who seems to be, what we all should be as girls, And she's actually the most powerful person in the picture. And it's interesting, Degas loved the painting and kept it in his studio all his life. So I love the idea that he had it as almost this motif. But both formally and, psychically, I just think it's such an extraordinary painting. The Young Spartans in particular has been a direct source, for these recent paintings. So you can actually see copies of the figures. I've stolen the figures straight out of there because, lots of artists are like this, sort of like magpies, where you steal or you take or you borrow what you need from somebody, but then obviously and hopefully it gets transformed. So I'm no longer referring to the Young Spartans when I'm painting, but I've drawn and painted them so many times that they're really embedded in my memory and in my kind of painting memory. So now, I just kind of I need that boy on all fours here. And, different figures from the painting are useful at different moments, almost a sort of punctuation. I'll have these almost seas of figures, some are more indistinct, and then you just sort of pluck one of them and dump them in there as a kind of, to weight the picture down. Or I feel like when the work gets more abstract, when there is no body, there's kind of no substance. I need the body as a kind of vehicle to talk about being alive. you know, to understand the world in a way, to like, it's kind of like needing something to hold on to, you know, it's the meat, the flesh of, you know, of life that one wants to be engaged with. For me, when the body disappears, it's almost like there's no there. It just becomes paint. It just becomes paint showing off, doing tricks, playing games, paint that's pleased with itself, paint that's kind of, you know, jumping through hoops. I need the paint to have a direction and the substance, and the substance that appeals to me is the body and talking about the body. And of course, that's incredibly broad, you know, but it seems that to talk about anything at all and all the range of things it means to be human, then it's to be found in the body. The painting behind me, for example, was frustrating almost because it came together too quickly, in that I really liked these crisscrossing legs that were there really almost at the beginning. And that can actually be a problem if something comes together too fast, because then, you know, you sort of don't want to lose it. You can see it has a lot of freshness and vitality. The more you go on with it, you risk losing. So that painting ended up sitting, you know, I probably worked on it for 2 weeks, and then I didn't want to touch it and left it for weeks. And that's often part of the process. So I put it away, don't look at it, you know, and then bring it out after a few weeks and see it much more clearly, especially in relation to what's been happening with the other works. Because, you know, it's always much more helpful for me to have a lot going on at once. Otherwise I get too neurotic and I'll tend to overpaint something rather than, you know, because I'll see problems where there aren't really problems. I'm sure when you're too close to something, it becomes impossible to see it. You tend to think it's much worse than it is or much better than it is. And either way, putting it aside, don't look at it for 3 weeks is easily the best way to deal with that, because either it's not nearly as good as you thought, and so you feel free to take whatever risks you want, or it's not nearly as bad, so almost the same result. The last 2 years really is one big loose body of work, starting with these crowds of women. This was kind of a breakthrough for me, because I'd been struggling to find a way to depict the figure, and in particular depict the face. Because there were a crowd of women and many figures instead of just one, it really allowed me to paint faces for the first time, really in years or ever, because I think, as most figurative artists would tell you, the face is so problematic, because famously, if there's a face in a painting, you automatically go to the face. And then the face seems to hold the meaning to the painting or the narrative, or people will assume the face has all the clues. So kind of the face always ends up giving too much personality. So doing this crowd of women opened everything up for me, because there were 10, 12, 13 women in a painting. I could paint the faces quite differently from one another. And they were almost comical in some cases. There'd be a cartoonish face, there'd be a more photographic face. And I realized I was sort of allowing myself to paint these different, first of all, allow different influences to come in. So there'd be a kind of Munch face or a Kirchner face. And whereas if there'd been just one face in the painting, I would have thought, oh God, you know, I would have got very uptight and thought, I can't do it like this, because then it looks like I think a face should look like that. But the freedom given by all these different ways to approach it really, really helped me move forward with painting figures, again, in a way that, you know, I really had missed I really wanted actual bodies in a space, which they'd almost completely disappeared the couple of years before that. If I can predict what's going to happen, that's a sign that I should be going in another direction. But I want very much that chance element. For example, it would be very boring to me to work out a composition before I started and then just paint it. You know, the element of surprise has to be there. I really like to sort of contradict myself and not let it all go too pleasantly in one direction. If something seems to be unfolding too easily, I'd like to disrupt it. I have to constantly disrupt and contradict it. So the chance is often more about, you know, if you home in on a painting, like the details, the paint itself, there's a lot of chance there, because you can't plan how a drip, you know, or how a particular glob of paint is going to have 3 different colors in it or something like that. But even, it's really a game of manipulating chance. when you feel like it's really close and you're quite happy in lots of ways, but you feel it's not quite there. That's the worst, because you know you can really lose everything. And you really can. What's very chancy is that things can be there 1 minute and then they're gone, and you actually can't get them back. So that's almost the hardest when, and you could say this is done. There are so many times when you could say yes, it's done, but you sort of know that you could push it a little further, but inevitably when you push it, sometimes you lose it. So, but a good friend of mine, the painter Charlene von Hale, has this expression about take no prisoners. You have to go into it with this take no prisoners attitude, whether you're just starting or very near the end. You have to be able to risk losing it.